Alright, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I'm Tokenicer, and I'm here to bring you guys in-depth news, analysis, and insights from the digital asset space, along with covering the progressive tokenization of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button to help with the algorithm, while also checking out Tokenicer.network for all my content platforms right in one spot. From my Twitter threads, Spotify podcasts, YouTube videos, interviews, Medium articles, and much more. And of course, that'll be right down in the description below for you guys. So in today's video, I'm bringing you guys another episode from my weekly show on Chain Stats, Tea Time with Token, where we dive into different initiatives and projects fundamentals in the digital asset space. So this can range from projects like Quant, Hedera, Casper, and other DLT networks, to some things like Hyperledger, Inapa, Corda, CBDCs, and other industry initiatives. Of course, most if not all of these episodes get uploaded to my YouTube after the live presentation in our Discord, but if you'd like to catch these live and join our Q&A at the end of every episode, be sure to join our ChainStats community with the link right down below. So in this week's Tea Time, our focus was around the Energy Web ecosystem for a little overview into what they're doing, some general connections and partners, their foundings, as sort of a little breakdown before I drop the Energy Web deep dive on you guys. So some of the main topics were like the Rocky Mountain Institute, their validator nodes, big partnerships of theirs, their tech stack EWT, some standards they're working alongside, and then their foundation council. And so just before we start, I just got to remind everyone real quick that I'm not a financial advisor, and therefore please don't take anything you see or hear from me as any form of financial or investment advice. But now that we got that out of the way, let's get right into it. Alright, so this is kind of a little map of the Energy Web deep dive that I've been working on. This isn't everything I've found quite yet, but this is, I want to say, a majority of the important stuff that I'm going to be diving into. So, as you guys can see, about half of this is done. I still have another half to do regarding the tokenomics and other connections. So what we're looking at here is basically one of the Energy Web founders, Rocky Mountain Institute. We'll go a bit further into what exactly they do as we get along this presentation. And then we're going to look at some of their validators within their network. So some of you guys have heard Energy Web does operate in kind of a different sense, where it's not like a completely permissionless network where anyone can join in and become a validator node, such as like Ethereum or Solana. So much like Hedera, as you guys know with them, they have a governance board of specific validators that they've selected, being large companies, right? So that's like IBM, Google, Boeing, Chainlink, etc. Energy Web has a pretty similar thing, and we'll take a look into some of the members that are validating for them. Then we looked at some partnerships they've had, well, some of the larger partnerships that they've had. We'll take a quick look into their tech stack and basically how each part of this infrastructure works. Some standards they're working on, such as the IREC, which is the International Renewable Energy Certificate Standard, and then the DREC, the Decentralized Energy Certificates, or not decentralized, sorry, but Distributed Renewable Energy Certificate. So we'll take a look into that, and then we'll finish off looking at their team and some connections within there. Well, this is a bit more than their team, it's their foundation council, and some of you guys may have seen this infographic going around on Twitter. It basically shows the foundation members within here, and then kind of what they did in the past, and the fact that they were validated by the European Commission. So let's get started with the Rocky Mountain Institute. So for those who don't know, Energy Web was actually founded by two companies, that being Rocky Mountain Institute and Grid Singularity. So what Rocky Mountain Institute does is pretty similar to what Energy Web is trying to do in terms of decarbonizing the world as a whole. So what we'll look into are certain connections that Rocky Mountain Institute has had both prior and after founding Energy Web. And then we'll look at some of their donor list, and then just some more connections. But let's start with Amory Lovins. So this guy's actually the founder of all of Rocky Mountain Institute back in the 1980s. And as we can see, he's, well, I guess you guys can't see too much here, but he's had quite a long list of history when it comes to innovating the energy sector. So the term negawatt, I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that, but it's basically a term that's used for describing units in watts of electrical power that's saved. And so this term was actually invented by Amory Lovins back in 1989. And then another accomplishment of his is that we can see since 1998 he's kind of had this idea for a hypercar vehicle. And this was a little outline of what it would have looked like. Now, nowadays the term hypercar has a completely different meaning, right? It usually refers to large, well, I don't want to say large, but really fast sports cars, to keep it simple, right? But back at the time when Amory Lovins had this concept, this was actually for a vehicle that would run on either hydropower or electricity, which we see a lot of nowadays. Well, more of the latter in terms of electric cars, right? There are hydropower cars that are in Japan in some places, but for the most part, the large part of adoption for decarbonizing the world and clean energy has been around electric cars, right? So as we see from this was made in 1998. So Amory kind of had this innovative vision for sustainability since, well, how long has that been? Like 25 years ago. So that's really saying a lot just in regards to kind of how this guy was thinking and his way of going about disrupting the industry. Now, if we look at some of the connections within the Rocky Mountain Institute and towards some large financial players, so we see here BlackRock and Rockefeller, some of the biggest names in the names of finance, right? Rockefeller may be big, well, they definitely are big, but that might not be the right way to describe them, as they work kind of more, behind the scenes and everything. But I'm sure many of you guys have heard of the stories about the Rockefellers, especially back in the day when they owned 90% of all the US oil at one point. If we look at the BlackRock connection, we see that BlackRock hired Paul Bodnar to lead sustainable investing, and this is a pretty new field of investments, right? But this is one that a lot of not just financial institutions, but even big tech companies are looking into, as the talks of sustainability and ESG just continue to grow. So Paul Bodnar, as you can see here, was actually managing director and chief strategy officer at Rocky Mountain Institute prior to joining BlackRock. And we can actually see from his experience here on his LinkedIn that he's worked at some pretty interesting places. So we actually see about a combined 5 years at the U.S. Department of State for things that are pretty relevant to his role now. So lead negotiator for climate finance, and then director for climate finance and counselor to the special envoy for climate change. Which, of course, climate change and everything climate and sustainability ties into what Rocky Mountain Institute is doing. And then being the lead for sustainable investing at BlackRock, I mean, that's saying a lot, right? So those are kind of some connections to Rocky Mountain Institute and BlackRock. Of course, many of you guys have probably also seen BlackRock giving Energy Web a shout out in regards to how they're going about creating a more green, sustainable market for crypto and especially Bitcoin. Because we've heard of kind of the sustainability and energy FUD with how much Bitcoin is using in terms of not hash rate, but just overall energy consumption. So this was the code I was talking about, where it says BlackRock is encouraged that organizations such as Rocky Mountain Institute and Energy Web are developing programs to bring greater transparency to sustainable energy usage in Bitcoin mining, and will follow progress around these initiatives. So that's really saying a lot, right? Because, I mean, how many projects do you think have this kind of support by someone as large as BlackRock? There's really not many, and especially the fact that Energy Web being founded by corporation like Rocky Mountain Institute that has the donations from really large players like these guys. So some of you guys may be able to read. I hope this is clear enough, but these are just some of the donors that are on Rocky Mountain Institute's list. And this was actually made by one of our community members in here, Jaron, who does a lot of great work for the Energy Web ecosystem, and I believe actually made the Energy Web Block Explorer. So you guys can see some of the big names here, right? There's the Bezos Earth Foundation, Google.org, Wells Fargo, FedEx, Energy Foundation China, Microsoft, the Rockefellers, Shell, Amazon, the Bank of America, Boston Consulting Group, Deloitte, United Airlines, Salesforce, Royal Bank of Canada, Ripple, Jesse Morris, and Barbara Lish. So Jesse Morris is the CEO of Energy Web. And then JP Morgan, ING, and Goldman Sachs. So these are really big names in a variety of industries, right? You've got the Bezos Earth Foundation, which is probably more towards the whole philanthropic and ESG kind of things. And you got big tech companies like Google, financial institutions like Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, and Goldman Sachs. And then you got some airlines, such as United Airlines, Deloitte, which is a big consulting firm, and then I guess FedEx can kind of tie into the whole concept of airlines in terms of overall just freight, logistics, and everything kind of traveling, revolving around energy usage and carbonization, right? And then, of course, Shell, which Shell will get more into very shortly as we get along this overview. But let's look into their validators now. So we see it's a pretty large group, right? It's a bit different from Hedera's in terms of the companies that are here. So it's much less of just the way Hedera does it is more like companies across different sectors and industries collaborating together for their side of the governance council. The Energy Web one is a lot more focused on energy infrastructure players and different core players that will play a role in transitioning us from the current energy grid we're on to the distributed energy grid. So the distributed energy grid consists of things like wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles, etc., right? It's a really hot topic that's been talked about for probably the past couple years or so. So we see some pretty big companies here though, right? So we see Vodafone, EDF, Photon, LO3 Energy, PTT, Singapore Group, TWL. I'll get into a few of these companies more in depth as we go along towards the bottom side of this. As we can see some of these companies listed here, right? But for the time being, let's take a look at their validator list. Hopefully you guys are seeing this on your end of the screen. Yeah, it seems like it. So this is basically a little interactive map of the validators within Energy Web. Anyone can go on this, and I'll put the link in the chat very shortly, actually, so you guys can look around. But you guys can basically click on all these different companies that are validators within their ecosystem. So, of course, there's Energy Web, but there's also, as we said, companies like TWL. So you can click on these, and it pretty much gives you an overview of what the company does, when they joined as a member, and where they're located around the world. So if you guys are interested in that, definitely be sure to take a look. There's some really interesting companies in here and some really large ones that I think you guys will be impressed to see them having joined the Energy Web ecosystem. Now let's take a look at some of their larger partners that I think are really playing a core role, or are going to play a core role as we transition further in kind of everything happening with distributed energy resources. So with R3, we talk about R3 a lot, right? But we talk about R3 when we're talking about them in the kind of fintech space. So when we're looking at guys like Quant or Ripple or XDC, that's kind of when we see mentions of R3. Really CBDC focused kind of things. So to see them within an energy infrastructure player is pretty interesting, right? But if you think about it, it does kind of make sense, because with how energy moves around the world, there's going to be different cross-border payments and types of settlements that are going to have to go through for people to get paid for the energy they provide or demand, right? So that's where R3 comes in, because on the Energy Web chain, pretty much everything is settled in Energy Web tokens in terms of different transfers of data, and this data being certificates and validations for consumption of energy, right? So large energy corporations obviously aren't going to want to be transacting in Energy Web tokens or any other crypto, really. Not even stable coins. Maybe not even stable coins yet. We might see that in the future. But for the time being, fiat is kind of the much preferred answer. And that's where R3 does its role. So pretty much on the back end, everything can settle in Energy Web tokens. So kind of think of it like how Quant's licensing structure works, where on the front end, enterprises and retail clients just pay in fiat, and then on the back end, it's all done in QNT tokens. That, to me, is personally the optimal way for onboarding clients, regardless of what level they are. Because at this point in time, I don't think is a good time for people to be, or not people, but companies to be requesting specific protocol functions to be just done in the native crypto asset there. Because, I mean, what corporation is going to want to go and market buy Energy Web tokens just to utilize the network? They're not. So it makes a lot more sense for the company to somehow automate that function on the back end and just take the fiat and maybe market buy the assets or something and have it run that way. So the role of R3 in here is that once it gets that transaction, it relays it to the Corda blockchain. That's kind of R3's proprietary solution. It's a private permission blockchain network that pretty much was built by, well, not built, but conceptualized by a lot of key players in the finance industry. And if you guys do want to see which players in the finance industry, I think on that 5-hour tea time episode I have on my YouTube, we actually took a deep dive into what R3 exactly is. But pretty much once Corda gets that message, so R3's blockchain, they relay that into Oracle's database, and it pretty much becomes like any other regular bill credit. So that's a lot more simple of a process to go through for both retail households and large enterprises, right? To just get the bill for their energy credits in fiat rather than in EWT. So I think down the line, the partnership with R3 is going to continue to get bigger as other digital forms of payments get integrated into the Energy Web ecosystem. And then with Hyperledger. So Hyperledger is one I really like talking about, right? A lot of you guys have probably seen some of the Hyperledger's breakdowns we've done in here. Essentially what Hyperledger is they offer a variety of different products, and some of you guys may have heard of them before. So there's things like Hyperledger Fabric, Hyperledger Besu, Hyperledger Firefly, Hyperledger Sawtooth, etc. I think there's about 16 to 19 different products on their end now. And what Energy Web's focus is with the Energy Web Foundation is that they're going to help with solving enterprise interoperability on Hyperledger Firefly across different chains and identity solutions. So maybe I should have put this in earlier, but one other large focus of Energy Web besides kind of tracing data of energy usage is digital identities. And I'm not just talking about digital identities of people like us, but they want to have a digital identity on everything that's going to be connected to the new energy grid. So that means each individual solar panel or wind turbine, electric vehicle or electric vehicle charging station. And then of course also different individuals too. So that's kind of what Energy Web is doing with Hyperledger in terms of allowing different cross-chain solutions to operate on Hyperledger Firefly and probably integrate into the Energy Web ecosystem sometime. Because I do think down the line, Energy Web will integrate different chains that they could deploy, say, different energy certificates to be traded on across different networks, but then get validated on the Energy Web chain first. Then there's Rocky Mountain Institute. So this is actually the founder of Energy Web, right? So interesting to see them collaborating together. What they're doing is working on a sustainable aviation fuel certificate. So this kind of ties into the other certificates they do with the International Renewable Energy Certificates standards, right? So this is specifically a standard for pretty much flight traveling for aviation, right? And this is a collaboration with the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. So to see, further work with Rocky Mountain Institute is, of course, a great thing, being that not only are they a founder of Energy Web, but they're absolutely massive, as we saw from some of the people backing them, right? And then there's also Elia Group. I don't know why it says 50 hertz there. I had to find a transparent logo, and this was the only one that popped up, unfortunately. But their company name is Elia Group. Pretty much what Energy Web's focus with them is a digital registry of electric vehicles and data of their product life cycles when they're plugged into different charging stations. So what Elia Group does is they're a transmission system operator out in Belgium, I believe, and they operate in a lot of different energy infrastructures, being a transmission system operator, right? On this end of their partnership, they're trying to have it so when a car is plugged into a charging station, you can pretty much get the full data life cycle of that specific electric vehicle in terms of things like when's the last time it's been charged, is it being charged using clean renewable energy, how clean is the energy, and where's that energy being generated from, etc. And then with MasterCard, this actually goes into a couple of their other partnerships, as what this is being integrated for is, of course, for payments, as that's kind of what MasterCard does, right? So this is kind of similar to that R3 partnership in terms of just simplifying payments overall on the network. And how this is going to work is pretty much when you plug it into an EV charging station, there's basically going to be different solutions that are connected to the Energy Web chain for paying for charging your electric vehicle, right? And so MasterCard is just going to be one of the supported options. Of course, there's probably going to be supported or other supported options down the line. And I do imagine MasterCard continuing to play a bigger role in terms of being a, maybe not preferred, but an option for payment in the Energy Web ecosystem. Because as we mentioned, these enterprises and corporations aren't going to want to be paying in Energy Web token, right? They're going to want to be doing this in fiat, which they've been so used to for, forever now. And then with the European Union, they actually have, as you guys can see, a variety of different partnerships together. So let's just quickly go over these. These are all kind of working in a consortium sense, so these aren't like one-on-one collaborations, but this is kind of a collaboration with the energy sector as a whole to transition them towards distributed energy resources. So there's Surpass. Surpass is basically a consortium that's building for a digital product passport, or in other words, a digital identity. So these digital identities, again, aren't just going to be towards people. They're actually going to start these digital identities with kind of everything happening in the energy sector and second life batteries, and then even the textiles industry. And then they'll probably start expanding this towards the, people, right? And then Omega X is a data marketplace infrastructure for a variety of different things. But of course, with Energy Web's kind of bread and butter, their focus on developing Omega X is going to be a infrastructure for a energy marketplace. And then Opentunity. This is pretty much the TLDR for it is further simplifying and solving interoperability for the energy grid, so different operators can just plug into the not the energy web, but the energy grid, because as these energy resources get more distributed to where, different people have solar panels on the rooftops and stuff, they're all going to want to connect that to the larger energy grid as a whole to help further balance and help with the flexibility of the grid. Cobalt P, this is a decentralized marketplace for second life electric vehicle batteries. And then Synogenes, I think I'm saying that right, is an energy storage toolkit. So one other topic in the energy sector that's been talked about quite a bit is how we can store or better store energy. And so Synergenes is kind of further building upon that with a toolkit to help with optimizing storage of energy. And then in Nexus, this is a initiative to integrate energy services across different sectors. So this can be like integrating energy renewable credits to, say, the finance industry for all the energy they have to use when they're printing money, for example. And then the last one we'll mention is Google Impact Challenge, which of course doesn't just extend to the European Union. As you guys can see, the name Google is in there. And this Impact Challenge was basically to integrate distributed energy resources and the whole grid infrastructure of that into Europe. So as we can see here, this is actually listed as a partnership between EnergyWeb and Google, where Google pretty much in this challenge, they funded 1 million euros to EnergyWeb to help with them to develop and build a digital framework for coordinating the distributed energy grid within Europe. Next, let's talk on their kind of tech stack and infrastructure. So the EnergyWeb, the EWDOS, this is kind of the tech stack for EnergyWeb. It basically stands for EnergyWeb Decentralized Operating System, and as you guys can see, this is split into 3 layers, right? There's the trust layer, the utility layer, and then the toolkits. So let's quickly go into the use cases of each point. Within the trust layer, the EnergyWeb chain, this is of course the infrastructure that hosts all the dApps on EnergyWeb as it would with any other chain, right? All the dApps are hosted on the Ethereum chain, or the Solana chain, or the AVAX chain. This kind of works the same way. I know the way I'm describing this might seem like EnergyWeb sounds a bit different from all those other application layers, but fundamentally, they are just another layer 1. The only difference is that they've really built this to be specialized for, the energy sector, right? As we've kind of seen with how their nodes operate in a permission sense, to where, yes, their network is public and permissionless, much like 95% of other blockchain networks out on the crypto market, but their nodes are completely permissioned in the sense that you can't just set a node up and run as a validator on EnergyWeb chain. They actually have to accept you into the node ecosystem. So back to the EnergyWeb chain. Where were we? So we talked about how was the infrastructure for all the dApps on EnergyWeb. It's also used to store and recall the digital identities and credentials that are going to be saved and logged onto the chain, because as we mentioned with their work on digital identities extending past people but to different products and assets within the energy grid, it's kind of needed as a way to store all that data and to recall it when different applications need to use and validate the identities, right? Which ties into the next point, validating on-chain dApps and energy utilities. And then validation of RECs. So RECs, as we mentioned, are renewable energy credits, and of course these are going to have to be validated in terms of ensuring that they are true and they're actually, getting the clean energy from a valid place, right? Or maybe a valid source. Valid clean energy source would be a better term for that. But next, let's talk about the utility layer. So this utility layer, as we see, has a lot of things that most blockchain networks would have, or I guess this is a different EnergyWeb or EWDOS infographic. In some of the older ones, you guys can actually see in the utility layer, there's some more, I don't want to say basic, but some more common functions that most layer 1 networks would have. So it would seem a lot more relatable and easier to understand. So there's things like, I've actually wrote it here for some of the other images of the EnergyWeb decentralized operating system, but they've got things listed like libraries, oracles, bridges, and name services. and I guess name services is right there, which are all kind of common things we're familiar with, right? Being in the space and looking at a bunch of different layer 1 networks, we hear things like oracles and bridges and name services, and then just a library or database all the time, right? Most blockchain networks need to have that to kind of have the stuff on the back end run. And so, much like what we just mentioned, the utility layer is pretty much made of backend functions, backend applications. For example, cloud infrastructure is a key integration within the utility layer. And then, of course, it's just used for different utilities that all kind of play a role in what the energy web chain at the foundation is doing, right? As the utility layer really ties these two together to ensure everything fundamentally works. And then we'll take a look at the application and toolkits. So we're just going to take a look at some of the key applications that are being built within the toolkits. Of course, the toolkits is pretty self-explanatory, right? This is kind of the software development kit that allows different developers to start building different applications on the energy web chain. So we'll talk about Switchboard first. So we can see different names up here, right? There's Switchboard, Zero, Origin. So we'll look into each of these. Switchboard, this is an identity access management that allows you to set parameters and permissions around IDs and verifiable claims. So this is going to be used in a lot of their applications that are focused on kind of clean energy. As let's say, again, when you plug in an electric vehicle, that plug station will need to know a certain amount of info before it can charge that device, right? So it'll have to know things like whose electric vehicle is this, and then kind of like where has that electric vehicle been, and when was the last time it was charged, etc. So that's kind of the data that Switchboard allows for, in addition to kind of setting these parameters. So let's say you stole someone's car and you're driving off with it, and someone reports that to, I don't know, the police station, and they report it to the transmission system operators as it's an electric vehicle. Well, if they get the identity of that vehicle and realize it's been stolen, they're not going to let it charge even when it's been plugged into the charging stations. And you know, a lot of people might be upset with that, saying that's like a breach on privacy and everything, but at the end of the day, that's kind of the future we're going towards in terms of transparency, right? And then Zero, this is another application within their toolkits. This is for renewable buyers that want to find renewable energy across the world. And essentially, it's like a global search engine for renewable energy certificates and other decarbonization products. And then Origin, this is kind of like the opposite of Zero. And this is kind of for data provenance to trace the ownership of renewable energy, along with being an open source solution for energy providers to connect to and operate on the new energy operating system. So Zero being more for people demanding renewable energy, and Origin being people that either supply or operate with different transmissions of energy on the grid. So they are kind of opposites, but at the same time, of course, they work hand in hand together, one being the supply side, one being the demand side. And then there's Flex. Flex is pretty much for registering different things like batteries, solar panels, or other distributed energy resources onto the Flex toolkit, which in return, you can be incentivized to help with balancing the grid with the different assets you've registered. So in short, it's further flexibility with the new grid, in addition to also being a toolkit for distributed energy integration into the energy web. So essentially, this kind of plays into kind of what they're doing with Europe in terms of easily connecting different energy assets into the energy web ecosystem to balance the grid when, you know, they might not be active or something, right? So that's kind of what we've got for the infrastructure of how the tech stack at Energy Web works. There's also two standards which I'll just really briefly go over. There's the International Renewable Energy Credit standard. This has been backed by over 50 countries now, and essentially what they're doing is just making this IREC standard so that when clean energy has been provided and consumed, you can validate that. Well, you can pretty much validate that. I guess you can call it a transaction of green energy consumption, and pretty much where that energy was generated, how it was transmitted towards the consumer of energy, etc. So just a lot of provenance things regarding ESG as a whole. And down here we can actually see these renewable energy credit marketplaces are actually already being built. So they've got 2 here. They've actually been building 3. They have one that they're building in El Salvador that I forgot to put a screenshot in here, but pretty much we see PTT and Energy Web Foundation launch blockchain-based renewable platform for Thailand and Japan, right? So PTT, for those who don't know, is a massive energy infrastructure player that's based in Thailand, and they're actually they're either government owned or state owned. I believe government owned, but they operate in various different countries, and they're a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So to see this kind of collaboration from Energy Web with PTT is pretty massive, and really goes to show just, you know, how much backing the Energy Web ecosystem as a whole has, right? Like, I mean, you're already working on an international standard for the sector that you're focused on, but now you're collaborating with industry leaders. And of course, they've kind of been doing that since day one with the foundation that they've had. Photon is doing a very similar thing with Energy Web in terms of building an IREC market in Turkey. And then the DREC standard. So this is the distributed renewable energy credit standard, right? This one is, the IREC standard is likely more for energy infrastructure players, where the DREC standard is probably going to be a more, I want to say, agnostic one, to where different people around the world can utilize the standard. So let's say you have a energy, or not an energy, but a solar energy panel attached to your rooftop, and you want to start kind of monetizing that, as you're not using all the energy that the solar panel is providing, and you're like, okay, well, maybe someone else could use this energy, and you can just route the energy elsewhere. Well, the DREC standard would kind of validate that the energy you were getting in terms of how you generated that solar energy is clean, and that it meets kind of the industry standards, right? So when we look into the DREC initiative, it's actually made by South Pole and Positive Capital Partners. But when we go into both their funding partners and implementation partners, we of course see Energy Web here. And then we see some other large players in here, right? So we see the International Finance Corporation, that's part of the World Bank, the IREC standards. So we know that these standards aren't competing, but they actually work hand in hand, right? And as I mentioned, they have different use cases for each one of these. And then if we look at South Pole, I'm sure most of you guys probably haven't heard of South Pole, but they've actually kind of extended this standard a little further, as they've gotten Process on board. And Process is pretty much another large multinational company. And here you can see that Process actually holds a 28% stake in Tencent, worth about $70 billion, which is saying a lot, right? Tencent is one of the biggest kind of conglomerate companies in the world. So to see someone that's holding about 30% of Tencent also join in on the standard, I think is pretty massive. And then here, this is just some of the collaborations within the South Pole Initiative, and we see some pretty large names beyond what we already saw in here, right? So we're seeing some large standard setting bodies such as the United Nations, the Asian Development Bank, again the World Bank, the Interdevelopment Bank, which if you guys remember when we were talking about LACchain, when we were deep diving quant, the Interdevelopment Bank is actually the founder of LACchain. And then there's also the Department for International Development, that's a UK department, and then the World Economic Forum. So a lot of large players behind these initiatives, and again, that's saying a lot, seeing Energy Web being an implementation partner, right? This pretty much meaning a lot of these solutions for these standards are going to be built on Energy Web. And finally, let's look at their Foundation Council. So, as I mentioned, this was directly on the European Commission website. As you know, we've kind of seen by now, Energy Web has been pretty heavily backed by the European Commission as a whole, with all the different collaborations they have going on. So this pretty much describes what Energy Web is doing, and then says the organization Energy Web Foundation, and then it lists the founders of the Foundation Council. And so here I pretty much broke down each of these founders. So Ewald, he was the CEO at Grid Singularity from 2016 to present day. And as I said, Grid Singularity is one of the other founders of the Energy Web ecosystem, right? I would say they're smaller than Rocky Mountain Institute, but they definitely play a pretty big role in the whole Energy Web vision, as they're also actually using blockchain technology to help with kind of the environment and clean energy as a whole. And then there's John. So he was the previous Chief Strategy Officer and Chief Product Officer of Rocky Mountain Institute for a good 6 years before he moved up to CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute, and he actually still holds that title even to present day. So, as you know, that was a pretty recent position. To see the current CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute also as a foundation member of Energy Web, that's pretty massive, and just goes further towards the ties that these continue to have, right? And for a good 12 years, from the year 2000 to 2012, the years before he joined Rocky Mountain Institute, he was at McKinsey & Company as a principal. And then there's Christoph. So Christoph, from 2001 to 2009, he was a senior director to the World Economic Forum, which is a pretty large position to be holding, right? And then he was a secretary general a bit after that for a good 10 years at the World Energy Council. So a lot of that, of course, tying into probably what he's doing with Energy Web now. And even to current day, actually, he's at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich as an advisor to the president. So, you know, more kind of connections within the tech infrastructure space. And then Etin, he has spent about 12 years at Engie as the head of R&D and digital innovations. So Engie is another kind of key energy player, and they play a pretty big role in the energy ecosystem, or Energy Web ecosystem. But they have a collaboration with Energy Web for, well, the Energy Web Foundation for expanding solar energy in the sub-Saharan African regions through crowdfunding using decentralized finance. So pretty interesting partnership, if you ask me. It's actually using the aspects of DeFi in a real world use case rather than, you know, the usual kind of just unregulated casinos we see across the whole DeFi ecosystem. And then Jules. So Jules spent 9 years as CEO of Rocky Mountain Institute. He held this position prior to when John Crates took the role. So to see, you know, one of the past CEOs of Rocky Mountain Institute and then even the current ones, again, just really adds to the connections there. And then from 2008 to 2011, he was actually the CEO of the European Climate Foundation. And he's also one of the commission members on the World Economic Forum's Future Council on Energy. So as we're seeing already, there's a lot of pretty strong connections on this board to not just Energy Web's founders, but some of their core partners and some large standard setting bodies. And then if we look at Anna, there's more work with standard setting bodies and Energy Web founders, right? So she was actually the co-founder and chief operating officer of Grid Singularity, the other end of founders for Energy Web. And then she's actually one of the foundation co-founders to the Energy Web Foundation. She's a tech pioneer for the World Economic Forum. That started from 2018, still goes on to present day. And then for the United Nations, she's on the advisory board for carbon neutrality, which ties into everything Energy Web is doing, right? And then lastly, we'll touch up on Patrick. Patrick, not so much experience in the energy sector as much as everyone here. Patrick is more focused on kind of the legal side of things, but as we can see, he's actually the chairman of the Casper Association. So that's a really interesting connection, right? Casper is another project we talk a lot around here. And while there's no direct relations to this, Casper being an enterprise-grade blockchain, they're likely going to need these green solutions at one point, right? So I can really see kind of a cross-chain solution. Well, maybe not cross-chain solution, but a interoperability or bridging solution to bring some of these energy certificates onto the Casper network to be purchased as an asset that first gets validated within the Energy Web ecosystem. And then lastly, let's touch up on a couple other members within the Energy Web team. So these were guys in the foundation. Down here are 3 guys from the team. So there's Ionis. He's the commercial director for Energy Web, and as we see, some of his previous experience are like member within the INAPA Energy Working Group. So we talk about INAPA a lot too, right? That's the International Association for Trusted Blockchain Applications. And if we look here, this is some of the connections there. So these 2 guys, I don't think I need to give them an introduction. This is Ismail Arribas. I've interviewed him previously. He's the he's the standardization co-chair for INAPA, in addition to being the convener for Working Group 3 within ISO TC 307. So that's the smart contract end of ISO TC 307. And of course, Gilbert Verdian, he doesn't need an introduction. And we can actually find some pretty interesting connections here. Obviously, there's INAPA with Ionis being a member of the Energy Working Group, and of course, Ismail and Gilbert both being co-chairs of the Standardization Working Group. And then we also see this Senelec. So this is pretty much the standardization group for energy and electricity in Europe. And one thing we see about them is they actually work directly with ISO TC 307. As this is a European kind of initiative. Gilbert has done a lot of work with everything in the EU, as he was also a member of the EU Blockchain Observatory Forum, which Ionis was also a member of. So pretty interesting to see these overlaps and connections, and it does make me think, is Energy Web going to try to operate on TC 307 standards? Because, I mean, it would make sense going forwards, as, they are compliant to these different energy standards already. It makes sense for them to be compliant as a blockchain standard as well. So we'll have to see how that goes, but definitely interesting to see how these standards line up already. And then here are just some more connections of Energy Web founders to different people in their team. So Ian Kelly, he's the global delivery director for Energy Web, and he was the manager for Rocky Mountain Institute for a good 4 years. And then Oriol, he is the business development lead for Energy Web at the moment, and previously was the Grid Singularity business development lead. So really interesting to see how certain team members within the founding organizations of Energy Web eventually migrated into the Energy Web ecosystem and are now working there. So it really makes you think of the resources and capital that they're allocating and focusing to build Energy Web out. And then down here we see different companies that founded the Energy Web Foundation. So we know Energy Web as a whole was founded mainly by Grid Singularity and Rocky Mountain Institute, right? These companies are also founders of Energy Web. So we see there's Shell, Tokyo Electric, Sempra, Equinor, Centrica, Stedin, TWL, Singapore Power, and Eli Group. And a lot of these are of course, very large energy infrastructure players, but some of these are actually government owned. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones are government owned at the moment, but I know Tokyo Electric is by the Japanese government, Equinor is by the Norway government, and then I believe TWL also is, along with Singapore Power. And then, of course, there's Shell, which is the fourth largest energy company in the world. So that's really saying a lot, seeing them being a founder of Energy Web as well. But that's about all we've got for this week's Energy Web overview. So hopefully everyone enjoyed it and got some good value out of it. But that's about all we've got for today. Peace.